Hi everyone, it's Dr. Jean Fourie here, and today I'm speaking about learning problems. So this is a broad concept, it is a very broad topic, and there is a lot of information about learning problems. I want to differentiate a little bit about how these things are classified. So if we have a look at learning problems, there is a variety of different learning problems that can exist in children, and these learning problems relate to various different areas. So last week we discussed intellectual disability, and I explained to you that intellectual disability is when the learner has difficulties in all areas of functioning. So they have difficulty with physical, cognitive, emotional, social functioning, and they are there's a range of intellectual disability, and we looked specifically at how those what the mild, moderate, severe, and profoundly intellectually disabled people look like, and what the characteristics are. So there are a whole lot of other disabilities. We can have children with multiple disabilities, physical, cognitive, sensory, children on the autism spectrum, and autism is another whole category of disability. We can have learners who have auditory impairments, who are hard of hearing, children who have visual impairments, who have difficulties with sight and blindness, difficulties with speech and language impairments, in particular speech difficulties of articulation and finding words. And then any orthopedic impairments relate to difficulties with the physical body of the learner, having deformities of arms and legs and spine, paraplegia, and so on. Traumatic brain injury, this is where there has been some trauma to the brain, such as if the child was in a car accident and they hit their head on the windscreen, or there was some physical trauma. They were hit very badly on the head somehow, and that caused trauma to the brain. Then we've got a whole lot of emotional disorders related to depressions and anxieties and schizophrenias and so on, and all sorts of health issues that children can have, cancers and various different childhood diseases. And then some people are deaf and blind. So these are the multiple difficulties. So there are various other categories of disability as well. However, we are looking specifically at the specific learning disabilities. So this is a category on its own, and the central concept of SLD is that there are problems with learning and cognition. And these problems are intrinsic, which means they're internal to the child's body. They're intrinsic to the individual. So they relate somehow to the neural system and the neural pathways that input information, process information, and output information. And the specific part of it is that these disabilities affect a relatively narrow range of academic and performance outcomes. So it is a narrow, when we're talking about a narrow range of academics, we're talking about difficulties with reading, writing, learning to spell, doing mathematics, the specifics of scholastic, of what we do at school. So SLD may also occur as a combination with other disorders. So it may also be comorbid with other conditions, such as ADHD and attention deficit disorder. However, if the child's intellectual functioning falls below the level of about a 70 on the IQ score, on an individualized IQ score, then the diagnosis will be an intellectual disability. So a learner who has an SLD has an average score on an IQ test. So they fall within the average range of an 80 to even a high functioning child with disability with an SLD would be 110 on the IQ score. So therefore you cannot have an ID and an SLD diagnosis simultaneously because of the underlying learning potential that the child has. So with an intellectual disability, there is really minimal potential to learn because of the damage to the central nervous system. However, with an SLD, there's minimal, there's certain areas that are influenced or have difficulty, and the overall functioning shows that the child has the potential to learn. And so these are the learners that we will see in a lot for remediation, because the strategies that we assist them with will assist to alleviate some of those difficulties that they have. So we also need to be cognizant of the sensory impairments. So if a learner has a problem with auditory perception, they've got some hearing difficulties that have been inherent during early childhood while the child was learning language, or if there are visual impairments inherent, the primary diagnosis will be an auditory or a visual impairment, and a secondary comorbid condition will be learning problems. But the diagnosis of SLD cannot be made if there are auditory or visual impairments present as well. So this is SLD is a standalone disorder. Specific learning disabilities are considered a high incidence disability. So they occur in a large number of children. And if one looks at some of the statistics, there are reports from the Departments of Education locally in South Africa and in other countries. There are generally large numbers of the children in the disability category who have SLD. So intellectual disability and specific learning disabilities tend to be the highest incidence of disabilities being reported. So specific learning disabilities, there are various definitions of this, and it will be useful for your assignment that you have to do on this task, on this topic, to go and have a look at the different disabilities, different definitions, but generally they relate to having a disorder in the basic psychological processes that are involved in understanding or using spoken or written language. So these basic underlying psychological processes I'm going to have a look at just now, and that manifests as difficulties with listening to language and acting on instructions, difficulties with cognition, thinking, processing, problem solving, difficulties with learning to read accurately and for meaning, difficulties with learning to write, to put your thoughts on paper, and spelling, difficulties with getting the sequence of the letters correct when spelling, and difficulties performing mathematical calculations. So these are the narrow range of performance outcomes that are affected by the underlying psychological processes that tend to be a deficit in a particular person or child. So learning disabilities is a general term, and when we speak about learning disabilities, there are a whole variety of terms that people will also consider to fall under this umbrella concept of learning disabilities. People will speak about a child who has dyslexia, and developmental dyslexia is an inability to learn to read that is inherent in the childhood phase. One can also acquire dyslexia. You learned to read while you were young, and then something happened to the brain. You had some brain injury or a lesion later on in life that affected the areas of the brain related to reading, and so the person can then acquire dyslexia. And the same can happen with all of these functions. Dysgraphia, severe difficulties with handwriting, extremely illegible writing, and also difficulties with conceptualizing ideas and putting them on the page in order to make the text make sense. Dyscalculia, look at all of these, they are severe difficulties. This is not just your average child who's battling a little bit. There has to be the manifestation of this difficulty has to be on the severe side of the spectrum in order for a professional to make these diagnoses. So despite good teaching, the child is not able to learn maths concepts and operations and how to do maths computations. So aphasia is severe difficulty with speaking fluently, articulating the words, and word finding problems, also known as anomia. This is the inability to find the words that are sitting in your brain. The person knows that word, but the neural connection is just not being made to pull that word out of the brain so that they can speak that particular word. And dyspraxia is the common term for a disorder called developmental coordination disorder, and this is severe difficulty with output, with coordinating the precise movements required to move all sorts of parts of the body. So the tongue and the mouth with spoken language, with generally handwriting. So this has got to do with the inability to get feedback from where the body is, so that the person can write, figure out where their body's position is in space, coordinate their movements. These people will have difficulty with basic functions like walking, tying shoelaces, walking up and down steps will be difficult. Just generally, if you have limited biofeedback in the nerves telling your brain where your body is in space, then this coordination difficulty arises. And I have put a little section in the content folder on developmental coordination disorder, so you can go and have a look at the content there and watch a little video of a presentation that I did with a student. So that gives you a good indication of all the highly specific things that fall within this general concept of learning disabilities. Then there are also, if there are any speech therapists, they will be concerned with central auditory processing disorders, and this is difficulties remembering auditory language. So the person's actual ear functioning works well. They can hear the sounds if they have an audiology test, but there are difficulties with the brain processing, remembering the language sounds. So if we look back at lectures that we've had on auditory perception, we can see there are lots of areas of auditory perception where there can be difficulties. And non-verbal learning disorders, these relate to any non-verbal problems. So trouble with reading body language, reading gestures, facial cues. These are children who are unable to pick up what other people's body language is telling them. Then we also have visual perception difficulties, and these are also related to dyslexia and dysgraphia. Often these things are intertwined. People give them specific these different names, but they all have manifestations in difficulties with doing the schoolwork that's required, from reading, copying things off the board, and so on. So if a diagnosis of SLD needs to be made, and can I just emphasize again that the only people that can make this proper diagnosis are practitioners who are registered with the Health Professions Council. So this diagnosis needs to be made by a psychiatrist or a psychologist who is able to do the full set of the full battery of tests, psychometric tests that are required in order to be clear about what the difficulty is. As learning support and remedial teachers, you will refer children that you suspect have these difficulties for a formal diagnostic process to happen. So the DSM-5, the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th version, is the book that psychiatrists and psychologists will be using to when they're looking at a child or a person. That will be the book that gives the clear guidelines. But a summary of the criteria is these 4 points. The first one is that the learner must experience difficulties, severe difficulties with their schoolwork. So it is difficulties with academic performance. And as we've seen, it's related to reading, writing, spelling, and maths, and language in general. So these are severe school difficulties is a manifestation of the underlying psychological processing difficulties. So there's a discrepancy between what we expect the child's achievement to be and what they are actually achieving. So we expect this learner to perform well at school because they just look like they should be able to do well. They don't have any physical disabilities. They don't have any blindness or deafness. Ears and eyes are working fine. There's no other genetic abnormality present. The child reached all their milestones and they come to school, and one expects that child to be able to do the schoolwork required. But then as the grades progress, the schoolwork becomes more difficult, and they start to realize that the child really has severe underlying psychological processes that are influencing their ability to read, to learn to do writing, maths, and spelling. So this discrepancy of what we expect from that child and what they are manifesting is usually shown in the first 2 or 3 grades. And there are difficulties present in these psychological processes. And the processes are the processing of perception, how we perceive, how our senses perceive information, and we've spoken about auditory and visual processing. Difficulties with attending to the task, your attention span, you need to be able to focus on a task, listen, read, take your psychological energy and put it into the space of that learning task. And then difficulties with memory, how the memory functions, and I will put a link into a lecture on some of the memory things. That's a whole lecture on its own. Difficulties with organizing. Organization from a psychological perspective has got to do with, yes, how we organize our physical spaces, but also how we organize our thinking and our metacognition. So metacognition has got to do with your ability to think about your thinking. And you will know if you've learned something, you will know what you don't know, you will be able to set tasks and goals for the learning process. You will think about your ability to initiate a learning session. You will be able to know how you learn best. Do you need to rewrite something many times, and so on. So metacognition is one of the psychological processes, the highest order of the psychological processes, where your executive functioning in the frontal cortex, the frontal lobe of the brain, is needs to be well developed for learning to take place. And we know that all these processes are developmental, so they increase, we get better at it as we practice it, and as children develop, they get better at doing these psychological processes. And then the fourth criteria for SLD is to rule out, which means that you must exclude various other causes. So we can't have visual, auditory impairments, severe motor difficulties like cerebral palsy, severe mental, emotional conditions, schizophrenias, bipolar disorders, severe depressions, and so on. All of those difficulties will also, people with those difficulties will also have learning problems because they're unable to do these basic psychological processes. However, if those conditions are present, then they become the primary diagnosis. So we rule out any of the other physical and emotional and mental and motor conditions. And only then can we say that these difficulties above, where we're seeing the severe inability to learn to read and write and so on, only then can we say that there is an SLD, a specific learning disability. So it is quite a stringent process that needs to be applied for this diagnosis, the actual label, the diagnosis to be made. Okay, so here's just another slide on this. So the person who is looking at the SLD will be examining all the areas of functioning. So they will be looking at oral language and reading and writing and all the listening, comprehension, the written expression of the child, looking at basic reading skills. And so we'll be looking at decoding, reading fluency, being able to read automatically, the automaticity skills inherent in reading, and then comprehending, understanding what you're reading, the underlying message of the text. There will also be mathematical tests involved, like actually looking at, can you do the computations of addition and subtraction, multiplication, division, and looking at maths problem solving. So being able to have people call them word problems, being able to have maths inherent in a complex language situation, and being able to really understand what is the maths involved underlying the language of the maths. So the learner is really not making adequate progress according to their age or the grade level standards in one or more of these areas of language and so on. And so what one sees as a psychologist, if one is doing a formal diagnostic process with a child who has true SLD, one will see a pattern of weaknesses in the test battery, so weak areas relating to reading, writing, spelling, and so on. And there will also be areas of strengths. So there will be certain areas where the learner is doing well. So they might be really good at concrete puzzle building, or something manipulative that they need to do with their hands. And so that is why a battery of tests will include a variety of different tasks that the learner needs to do. There will be puzzles and blocks and shapes and reading and maths and writing and spelling, and a variety of different psychometric tests that look at different things, because at the end of the day, you want to see if there is a profile where there are areas of weakness and areas of strength. And these areas of strength are what will be pulled upon when one is doing the interventions with the learner. So this whole diagnostic process is what will happen with a professional who is doing this diagnostic process with the learner. So I briefly want to have a look at the 5 cognitive processes, and just so that you get an idea of what they all involve. And psychological processes is a very broad term, but it incorporates a wide variety of thinking skills that we use to process and to learn information. So generally it's divided into these 5 cognitive processes that we know are involved with learning. And these processes are continually taking place while you are, whether you're, when you're conscious and awake. Some of these processes are also taking place while you're asleep. There are certain perceptual processes that happen where you're where unconsciously you are able to hear sounds around you and so on. But generally, we're talking about conscious processing during waking hours here. And these processes are interrelated, they're pretty fluid, and they have lots of highly specific areas. If scientists are researching these things, they research them in really minute detail for all of them. Okay, so there are other psychological processes relating to one's emotions and motivation and your ability to be self-motivated, to be intrinsically motivated, but we're not going to look at those as part of the SLD diagnosis. So we're going to start with perception and then look at a little bit of attention, a bit of memory, metacognition, and this process of organizing. So perception is that ability to interpret the information that comes into our bodies through all our sensory channels. And the main channels of learning that happens at school is visual and auditory input. So we are really focusing at school level on being able to see graphs and charts and text that we have to read, and to listen to the auditory input from teachers and videos and wherever else we're getting auditory information from. So our sense of perception takes place inside the areas of the brain where the neurons are have received the information from the outside world, and they are now processing that information in various different parts of the brain and integrating it. So being able to discriminate different things. We looked at the perception, auditory and visual perception, being able to discriminate, see small differences, hear small differences, and remember that information in the brain is got to do with perception. So this is the first psychological process that might have underlying deficits that will lead to an SLD. Attention is our ability to obviously attend to a task, to be focused on receiving and processing the information that we need to look at or process at that particular time. And part of attention is an ability to block out all the things that are happening around you that don't have relevance. So to be able to focus on the task and not to be distracted by other noise or other movements in the classroom, other things that are happening, to be able to attend to and focus on the task without being distracted. And so the process, the psychological process of attention, is also a process that can be taught, and that we need to ensure that there are periods of time where children are allowed to focus without constantly being distracted by either outside things, cell phones, other noises that are happening around them. So when a child is attending to a task, or there's a task being given, to give clear instructions of how long you expect them to work on that task, and that they must attend this and read this and finish this particular worksheet or do these 5 comprehension questions. And one can use timers and various things to help the child to know that that is what you will attend to now, and not be distracted by anything else for the next time period. Because attention, an ability to focus, is also developmental. It can be taught, and we can improve the child's functioning of attending. And as people grow older, they should be able to attend for longer and longer periods of time. So attention starts with a relatively small time frame, and generally we add 3 minutes onto the child's age. So if you're 6, you should be able to attend 6, 7, 8, 9 for 9 minutes, and then move on to another task. So one of the crucial underlying psychological processes involved with learning is memory, and our ability to remember things is just one of the most amazing things that our human brains are able to do. And this is the process of encoding, so taking the experiences that we have of the world around us and encoding them into neural signals in the brain. So this process of encoding, storing that information in some kind of neural network, retaining that information in the neural network, and then also being able to retrieve it and recall that information of either facts or procedures that we've learned to do for future use. So memory is a really complex psychological process, and there's a lot of new research going on in this area, particularly now that people have all sorts of technology able to look at neural functioning, spectroscopy, able to have a look at how brains are actually firing and how neurons are being generated, neurogenesis in the encoding and in the creation of memories. So there's a lot happening in the psychological process of memory. And at each of these stages, there can be difficulties for the child who has learning problems. So metacognition, this is the ability to monitor and evaluate your own performance. This process generally is happening in the frontal lobe. It is also sometimes, well, it is associated with executive functioning. And when we speak about that, we're talking about all the skills of you being able to identify and select learning techniques that will allow you to be able to acquire information. So the person's ability to know how they learn, to choose and create the settings in which they are most likely to receive information accurately. So knowing how you need to have the text written, the space in which you need to learn, being able to identify the most effective and efficient ways to process information, to present information. Some people like to rewrite things many times. Other people will make mind maps using colors. Some people want to learn by typing things on a computer. So being able to figure out the most efficient ways to process the information that you're learning at that particular time. And then to evaluate how I've learned. Did I learn this? And then to be able to adapt the learning techniques to different materials and situations. So metacognition has all got to do with your ability to know how you are learning and what is best for you in order to be able to learn the material. And the last of the 5 underlying psychological processes is the organizing of information. And this ability to do psychological organizing affects all of our most superficial tasks that you do, organizing your desk or making a shopping list, organizing your home or your cupboards, your items, your belongings into spaces, to complex cognitive activities, serious problem solving, being able to do complex projects of scientific nature. All of these require organizational skills. Being able to organize your thought processes, being able to organize your school bag, keeping track of all the things that are needed for all the different subjects and classes that a child goes through during the day, organizing the environment. All of these organizational skills relate to psychological processes, and there can be deficits or difficulties in underlying organizational skills that we have. And it is, as with all psychological processes, it is developmental. It requires active thinking about, active work on it, so that one can organize one's space and learning processes. And it can be taught, and people can get better at it. Okay, and then just to be aware that an SLD will influence all aspects of a child's functioning. So a learner who has any kind of learning difficulty will often become aware of these difficulties. Their self-esteem will get worse, and so their social and emotional development can also be affected. And then there's this interplay of the more the person thinks that they can't do something, the less time they will spend on that topic, and so social and emotional development also is compromised if there are underlying learning problems. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. I hope that that has given you a really good starting foundation for going and reading up and learning a lot more about this just vast topic of specific learning disabilities.